Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is a really rigorous, almost shocking framework called the Xenobacillary theory of cultural immunity, or XT. It uses these, well, deep biological and microbial analogies to completely reconceive how cultural systems manage safety, symbolic order, and their own viability. It really positions cultural analysis, squarely within biosemiotics.
It's certainly a radical reframing. I mean, it challenges so many foundational assumptions about what stability even means for a coherent social system.
Exactly. So the central question we're really facing here, and it comes right out of the source material, is this. Does the Xenobacillary theory provide the definitive, necessary model for understanding cultural persistence? A model that emphasizes, let's call it productive instability, and the vital function of symbolic parasites.
Right, and this is where I'll be arguing. If in its intense focus on disorder, it fundamentally overlooks the non-negotiable requirements of, traditional coherence and structural necessity.
Right.
I'll be making the case for the latter. That coherence, which is often preserved through inherited myths and a commitment to fixed, even if temporary identity, is an absolute prerequisite for meaning to be assembled at all. I think the XT risks mistaking necessary scaffolding for, unnecessary constraint.
And I'll be presenting the argument that immunity is fundamentally a semiotic negotiation, one that is entirely dependent on these very parasitic systems, viewing the noise not as an error, but as the engine of survival itself. So, to begin, let's establish the Xenobacillary premise. For systems that communicate, biological, cultural, whatever, safety is rarely a material state. It's articulated through abstract protocols, symbolic assurances. I hold that safety is not the passive absence of pathogens, but the active, regulated coexistence with them. Immunity, then, isn't a static fortress. It's a dynamic grammar, a structured, metabolically active negotiation.
I can acknowledge the strength of viewing immunity as a dynamic negotiation, but I would argue that any negotiation still requires a recognizable self on both sides of that interface.
But that's just it. The cultural system's central metabolic operation, in this view, is pure feedback. The relentless flood of inscriptions, data, signs, narratives, regulations, it all functions like a kind of voltage driving the system. The crucial insight here is the identification of Xenobacillus B. It's the key symbolic organism. It doesn't proliferate in the centralized tissue of the system, but right at the interface, in the spaces of mediation and transition. Shardy asserts that symbolic order has always been parasitic, dependent on noise, on systemic delay, on intentional misalignment. Pathogens aren't simple errors in sequencing. They are structured disorders of sequencing logic. And this model reveals that what looks like contamination is often an edited experiential concept, a regulated distortion that allows the system to stay viable by adapting.
Okay, that's a compelling argument about the productive potential of these parasitic systems. I'll give you that. However, I really do believe the Xenobacillary theory risks elevating destabilization to a primary principle, and in doing so, it dangerously undercuts the necessary conditions for meaning assembly. While XT focuses so intensely on the mechanism of Xenobacillary B, it neglects the fundamental structures of coherence that have to be preserved for that meaning to function across time.
But if the symbolic order is, by definition, already parasitic, if noise is just intrinsic to how the system communicates, then what stable coherence are we even talking about? I mean, how can you maintain an idea of a stable, fixed structure when the very act of communication is itself parasitic?
We are talking about the mechanisms of preservation, the things that operate over vast timescales, often through what the material calls inheritance myths. Think of our origin stories, our foundational legal texts or spiritual documents. These aren't just misinterpretations or archival errors. They are narratives that, and I'm quoting here, recruit life as necessity. They provide the structural stability that you need for metabolic memory. They function as essential boundaries. The material calls it the cyst as spatial narrative, which provides a necessary, temporary enclosure against perpetual debilitating disorder.
I'm not entirely convinced by that because it implies the boundary is inherently protective. It could just be a momentary artifact or even a misinterpretation of the metabolic exchange that's always going on.
Well, my concern here really hinges on that structural necessity. XD argues that mechanical language fails not because it is artificial, but because it denies its own parasitic conditions. And look, I agree that denying relationality is a problem, but a total dissolution of fixed identity, this constant, immediate denial of structural continuity, it just makes functional, generational, societal communication impossible. To assemble anything coherently transmissible, this system has to possess a bounded interior, a defined self, even if that boundary is dynamic and temporary. If nothing is anchored, how does transmission even occur?
And that brings us right to our first key clash, the function of disorder versus the need for linear sequencing. From the XT perspective, the glitches, the noise, they aren't flaws in our narrative assumptions. They are structural disclosures of the system's true nonlinear reality. Replication here isn't rigid copying. Think of it more like membrane behavior, selective permeability, delay, transformation. Parasitic systems are productive precisely because they destabilize the simplistic assumption of linear sequencing. The delay and the transformation, that is the metabolic engine.
Okay, but this. Enthusiasm for destabilization, it raises a critical question. Can a system that's dependent entirely on disruption maintain what the theory itself calls ribosomal reality?
Could you just clarify ribosomal reality for everyone?
Absolutely. It means the system's fundamental, necessary capacity to assemble stable, functioning relationships. The baseline generative function. If symbolic order has always been parasitic, we need a far more rigorous mechanism than XT provides to distinguish between, say, necessary energetic arrangements, like an adaptive fever or focused intellectual engagement, and static panic, which the source material explicitly notes freezes symbolic flow. If every sequence is instantly destabilized, you don't get transformation, you get communicative collapse. Sequencing, even if it's destined to be transformed, requires some foundational linear assumption just to prevent a total loss of function.
I think that's a misreading. Static panic occurs precisely when that vital microbial symbolism is misread as pure disorder. The goal of XT is not to achieve stasis, which is defined as absolute latency or archival control, but an intensification of circulation and mediation. The system stays viable because the disorder is read as a structured grammar, a complex negotiation. I mean, look at the intense viral transition we see in the infectious agreement of the psalm, or the function of preconnoidal linguistics. These transitions are still complex forms of sense, not just chaos. They're recoding the system's reality through the disorder.
I just find the line between a structured negotiation and sheer, overwhelming noise to be far thinner than you're suggesting. It seems XT would always prefer a fever to quiet.
The quiet is death. It's the end of metabolism.
Well, that leads us right to our second clash, then, the utility of enclosure. You quoted the XT assertion that confinement is not protection but misinterpretation. Okay, but if anxiety and panic, which manifests as a kind of cultural inflammation, if they signal a semiotic overload, isn't temporary confinement or enclosure the lure of the cyst as spatial narrative? Isn't that a necessary, localized, adaptive response to manage that unbearable voltage? If the system is facing communicative burnout, you need a circuit breaker, however temporary, to restore function.
That circuit breaker analogy fails because temporary confinement so quickly becomes permanent archival stasis. Imposing absolute latency suspends metabolic exchange entirely. Immunity, paradoxically, always implies exposure. You can think of the protective function of archival openings in the oldest biological systems. To retreat entirely is to surrender the capacity for negotiation. Let's look at the highly sophisticated immunological logic of antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity, or ADCC.
Okay, that's a very specific biological term. How does that translate into a cultural function?
It translates perfectly. The ADCC mechanism operates in what the material describes as a masochistic logic. Recognition happens through binding to precisely what harms. In cultural terms, this means our viability is predicated on active, regulated engagement with the very ideas or parasitic systems that threaten our coherence. The system defines itself only by active, metabolically engaging the threat, not by simple enclosure or suspending reality.
I understand the attraction of constant active engagement, but I'm still unconvinced that the complete rejection of confinement is viable. If existence reconstructed under archival regimes, even if you ultimately label it a protective error, if that allows systems to maintain the structural integrity to postpone what the text calls the alpha microbes, the ultimate figures of mastery and exploitation, then isn't some structural integrity justified?
But integrity gained through withdrawal is an illusion.
But the very function of postponement requires a degree of foundational stability that you're just dismissing as a misinterpretation. If the system is constantly adapting its identity based on the latest parasite, it lacks the anchor it needs to project a future that's resistant to those alpha microbes. Those microbes seek to impose a total, fixed identity, a monopoly on meaning. Resisting them requires some kind of fixed operational baseline.
That baseline is achieved not by locking the door, but by constantly metabolizing the parasitic condition.
And that constant metabolism brings us squarely to the issue of identity. I mean, if we're constantly metabolizing, is there anything left to metabolize? Which leads us right to the profound relationship between circulation, meaning, and fixed identity.
Exactly. And I'll reiterate the XT claim. Cold inscriptions of bacterial catalysts circulate without fixing identity. Circulation itself is the meaning. Meaning operates like organelles, not commodities. Organelles exist in a flow, defined by their function in the metabolic process. The XT perspective holds that the attempt at identity fixation leads to a monopolized, performative, eroticized language, a mechanical language that inevitably fails because it denies the necessary condition of parasitism. Circulation, delay, and mediation. That is the very substance of survival.
But let's look at this through the lens of generational transmission, which is where my concern about fixed identity really peaks. While XT champions dissipation and, low-energy anaerobic computation, like in anaerobial systems, this perspective fundamentally marginalizes the enduring role of literature and cultural persistence. Literature functions as the spirit of traditional coherence, precisely because it preserves these inheritance myths across millennia.
But those myths are successful because they are the most effective regulated distortions.
Distortions, maybe, but for literature's sake, the foundational epics or constitutional narratives that define a culture, for them to pass on essential experiential concepts, even if they are distortions, that process demands shared, stable reference. The symbols have to mean the same basic thing long enough for the next generation to engage with the disorder constructively. If everything is perpetually unfixed and identity is just a transient flow, transmission becomes pure noise, not a structured negotiation. The very act of writing requires a temporary agreement on symbolic fixedness.
But that's a misunderstanding of what XT means by circulation without fixing identity. It means identity isn't monopolized by the host or the parasite, but resides only in the flow between them. When we read a foundational myth, we are engaging with a highly effective membrane behavior, a structure that permits the flow of meaning without allowing any single element, be it the myth, the reader, or the author, to claim ultimate fixed authority. The myth works because it is an effective carrier of Xenobacillus B's grammar.
I just disagree that this avoids fixation. For a myth to recruit life as necessity, it has to define necessity in a stable way. When we transmit a fixed ritual or a legal code, we are temporarily asserting a fixed identity. We are saying this boundary, however temporary, must be respected for the sake of survival. We need that anchor to distinguish productive, energetic engagement from a debilitating collapse.
The parasite is the anchor because its constant presence dictates the host's continuous metabolic response.
And that is where the tension remains. Is the parasite the structure, or is it merely the necessary catalyst that reveals the structure's limits?
Indeed. Look,
To summarize my position, the Xenobacillary ethics demands that we treat immunity not as a state of purity, but as a semiotic negotiation. It means accepting error as the fundamental condition of survival. Xenobacillary B is not an alien invader, but the unavoidable mediation necessary for life, language, and meaning to persist. Its presence ensures that viability is achieved productively and never through isolation. By recognizing the grammar of this microbial symbolism, we find the true potential of the system.
And I'll concede the profound intellectual power of reframing safety through productive parasitism and the necessity of exposure to maintain metabolic exchange. However, my persistent caution lies in the necessity of coherence, of structural integrity, and the functional inheritance myths that create the lure of the cyst as a necessary bounded interior. Without these temporary anchors, I believe the system cannot maintain the regulated order required to assemble meaning in the first place. The tension remains between the necessity of constant metabolic exchange and the non-negotiable requirement for regulated temporary order.
Ultimately, both frameworks draw deeply on the material's sophisticated biological analogies to illuminate the relationship between order, noise, and viability. We're left with the crucial decision of where to draw that elusive line, between the noise that fosters adaptation and the noise that simply obliterates the signal.
A decision that profoundly affects how we understand cultural persistence itself.
Precisely. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.